Welcome to our coding session. So our goal in this Drupal installation is to set up a Drupal website with data persistence. We'll be setting up Drupal, MariaDB, and Adminer on Docker containers. Our website data will be stored on our host computer so that if the containers are deleted, our data will be restored when we create new containers. I have my workspace directory open here, which I named Drupal Docker. This is just a directory on my desktop, and we'll be storing our Drupal website data in this directory. So to give you a much better understanding of what we're doing and why we're doing it, let's set up a quick Drupal website with no data persistence. We'll start simple and we'll progress from there. So to create a new Drupal website, I'll start by creating a project directory. We'll be using Docker Compose, so I'll need a Docker Compose file as well. So I'll start a new terminal using my keyboard shortcut. And I'll create a new project directory, and I'll call this Drupal1. And in this directory, I'll create my Docker Compose file. The name is docker-compose.yml. Now that we have our Docker Compose file, I'll go ahead and add some keys and information. The first one here is going to be the version. I've already explained the content of this Docker Compose file, so I won't be explaining them here. Next is services. Our first service here is going to be Drupal, and I'll name this service Drupal1. Image is Drupal with the tag latest. For the ports, I'm going to map port 8081 on our host computer to port 80 on the Drupal container. Finally, our Drupal service depends on MariaDB. I'm going to name the service MariaDB1. Alright, so we're done with the Drupal service, so let's define our MariaDB service. We'll name this service MariaDB1. Please make sure that your MariaDB service name matches the service name that Drupal depends on, because Docker will start the MariaDB service before it starts the Drupal service. Next is the image, which is MariaDB. Finally, we'll add some environment variables so that our database is created automatically for us. The first one here is MariaDB root password. And this will be equal to root. Next is MariaDB database. I'll set this to Drupal1 for convenience. So just to be clear, the database name has nothing to do with the service name for a Drupal container. It's just a coincidence that I'm naming them the same. You can use whatever name you like here, but of course you should use a secure database username and password on a production website. Next is MariaDB user. This will be Drupal1 as well for convenience. Finally, MariaDB password. I'll set this to Drupal1 as well for convenience. Alright, so we're done with our Docker Compose file. We'll save, and I'll make sure I'm here on my project root where my Docker Compose file is located. Alright, so I'll run Docker Compose up with the option D for detached mode, so it runs in the background. So what Docker is going to do is check on our local Docker repository to see if these images exist. If they don't exist, then Docker is going to go online to Docker Hub to pull these images. And then it's going to create a container for each of these images. And that's what it's doing now. Okay, so it's done creating our containers. And you can see on our Docker desktop here that these containers are running. And since we run Docker Compose in detached mode, you can always run Docker Compose logs to see what Docker did in the background while creating our Drupal and MariaDB containers. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is log into the Drupal container to see its directory structure, okay? So the command to log into the bash terminal of our Drupal container is docker compose exec Drupal1 bash. Remember, Drupal1 is the service name for our Drupal container. Now, this is a Docker Compose command, so you have to run it on your project directory where your Docker Compose file is located. Okay, so we're in the bash terminal of our Drupal container. The first command I'm going to type is pwd to print our working directory. Okay, so it shows us the full path to our working directory. That is, we're in the Drupal directory inside the opt directory, which is a top-level directory in the Drupal container, okay? So whenever we log into our Drupal container created from this Drupal image we're using, this is the directory that we're going to land on. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is type ls to list the contents of this Drupal directory. So notice that this directory has a Drupal project created by Composer. And if we go to the browser and navigate to the local host, I believe we mapped port 8081 to our Drupal container. You'll see we have a Drupal project in this container, and we can go ahead and install our Drupal website. Okay, so the next command I'm going to type here is ls space / to list the content of our top-level directory. There are lots of directories here, but we're only interested in 2 directories. So let's head over to our visual board and explore these directories. Here's another look at the directories we saw on the terminal. So we're interested in the opt and var directories. When we expand these 2 directories, the directory structure looks like this. So let's examine the Docker file for our Drupal image and container and get a better understanding of our Drupal container setup. At the bottom of this Docker file, there are a few specific commands I want to highlight. The work-dir command on line 79 sets the working directory of our Drupal container to the Drupal directory. This means that whenever we connect to the Drupal container, this directory will be our starting point. And you saw that previously on the terminal. Also, any commands we run on the terminal will be executed in this directory. Notice on line 82 that Composer creates a Drupal project in this Drupal directory. On line 85, Docker creates a symbolic link between Apache's default document root and Drupal's web root directory. Apache by default is configured to look for our index.php file in the HTML directory. With this symbolic linking, when Apache looks in the HTML directory, it is actually looking in the web directory where Drupal's index.php file is located. Since our Drupal project lives in the Drupal directory, our goal is to have a consistent copy of this directory on our host computer, and we can achieve this using volume mapping. Now, the way volume mapping works is that if you map a directory called Drupal-data on the host computer to a directory called Drupal on the Docker container, Docker will mount Drupal-data on the container, which means the container will be using Drupal-data as its Drupal directory. Essentially, the container and the host computer will be using the same Drupal-data directory, though the directory will be renamed as Drupal inside the container. It's important to note that Docker Compose file settings take precedence over Docker file settings. As we've seen from our Drupal container, without volume mapping, Composer creates a Drupal project in the Drupal directory based on the Docker file instruction on line 82. In our volume mapping for our Docker Compose file, however, we are mapping an empty Drupal-data directory to the Drupal directory of our container. Based on Docker Compose precedence over Dockerfile, this means that at the time the Drupal container is created, the Drupal directory will be empty because the Drupal directory inside the container is the same as the Drupal-data directory on the host computer. The consequence of this volume mapping is that when our Drupal container is created, we don't have a Drupal project inside the Drupal directory of the container. But that's okay. We have Composer installed in our Drupal container. So all we have to do is run the Composer command again inside the container and we'll have our Drupal project back. This time, the Drupal project will be created not just inside the container, but also on our host computer. Remember, the container is using our Drupal-data directory as its Drupal directory. Notice how we don't need to install Composer, PHP, Apache, or any of these components on our host computer since we have them inside the Drupal container. This is one of the goals of our containerized Drupal installation. As I mentioned previously, all we need is Docker Desktop and our IDE or code editor to install and have a persistent copy of our Drupal website using Docker. For the MariaDB service, Docker handles volume mapping in a similar way. We map an empty MariaDB-data directory on our host computer to the MySQL directory inside the MariaDB container. Docker mounts the MariaDB-data inside the MariaDB container as its MySQL directory. This time, however, there's no extra step to take because the database inside the container is initially empty. Drupal only starts writing to the database when it's been installed, so there's no existing data to recreate like we did in our Drupal setup. Alright, here's a summary of the steps we'll take to achieve our Drupal installation with data persistence. First, we create our Drupal-data and MariaDB-data directories, then we define Drupal, MariaDB, and Adminer in a Docker Compose file with volume mappings from our host computer to the Docker containers. Once the Docker Compose file is run, these containers are created and Docker automatically creates a bridge network for them. At the same time, Docker mounts the specified directories from our host file system into the Docker container file system as defined by Docker volumes. Essentially, Docker makes our host file system directories accessible to the containers. Next, we run the Composer command inside the Drupal container to create our Drupal project. Composer downloads Drupal with all its dependencies into the Drupal directory of the container, which is the same as the Drupal-data directory on our host file system. This gives us a persistent copy of our Drupal website running inside the container. We'll then proceed to install Drupal. If the containers are deleted and created again, our data is restored to the containers from our host file system. Let's head back to our VS Code terminal to begin our Drupal installation. Back to our terminal. Let's finish our Drupal installation with no data persistence. I'll open my browser and proceed with the installation. We'll continue with the standard installation. We used Drupal1 for our database name. And I'll copy and paste that as well for our database username and password. For the host part, Drupal is asking for the name of the server where the database is installed. And since we're using Docker Compose, Drupal can reference the MariaDB server with its service name, okay? Our MariaDB server is named MariaDB1. So I'll enter that here. Everything else looks good, so we'll save and continue. Our Drupal website is now being installed. Okay, Drupal has now been installed. Next, we'll configure our website. For our website name, we'll call this Drupal1 test site. Email address is drupal1@160bits.com. We'll use test1 for our username. And we'll copy and paste that for the password field as well. Everything else looks good. So we'll save and continue. Okay, so our Drupal website is now installed and configured. And this is the point where we start building our website. So before we proceed to our next installation, let's create a random article content. So I'll click on content. Select article. I'll call this test article. And for the body, I'll just say this is a test article that won't persist. I'll save and publish. Okay, we're done with our Drupal website with no data persistence. Let's go ahead and install a Drupal website with data persistence. So I'll make sure I'm in my root directory. And I'll create a new project directory. I'll call this Drupal 2. Inside Drupal 2, I'll create an empty Drupal-data directory. I'll create another empty MariaDB-data directory as well. And since we're using Docker Compose for this setup, I'll also create a Docker Compose file. Now that we have our Docker Compose file created, let's go ahead and add some information. I'll start with the version. Next is services. Our first service here is Drupal. We'll call this Drupal 2 since it's our second Drupal installation. For the image, it's Drupal with the tag latest. For the ports, I'm going to map port 8082 on our host computer to port 80 on the Drupal container. Remember to always map port 80 to the Drupal container, okay? Because Apache inside the container is configured to listen to HTTP connections on port 80. Okay, for the volumes, I'm going to map our Drupal-data directory on our host computer to the /opt/Drupal directory inside the Drupal container. And I've already explained what this volume mapping will do when our Drupal container is created. Finally, our Drupal service depends on MariaDB. So I'll call this MariaDB2. Let's define our MariaDB service now. We'll call this service MariaDB2. Make sure it matches with the Drupal service name that Drupal depends on, okay? The image is MariaDB. Our environment variables are next. I'll actually copy these environment variables from our previous file and paste, so you don't have to watch me type it all out. I'll just use database2 for the database name, database user, and password. Finally, our volume mapping. I'll map our MariaDB-data directory on our host computer to the /var/lib/MySQL directory on the MariaDB container. Alright, so we're done with the MariaDB service. Our next service is adminer. I'll call this adminer. The image is adminer. For the ports, I'll map port 8092 on our host computer to port 8092 on the adminer container. Okay, everything looks good. We'll save and we'll make sure we are in our project directory where we have our Docker Compose file. And then we'll type Docker Compose up with the option D so it runs in detached mode. So these containers should be created faster than the last time because we have these Docker images on our local Docker repository. Okay, so our Docker containers have now been created, and we can see the containers running on this Docker Compose setup by running Docker Compose PS. So our containers are running. The next thing I'm going to do is connect to our Drupal container. And the command for that is docker compose exec Drupal2 bash. Remember, Drupal2 is the service name for our Drupal container. Okay, so we're in the Drupal container. The first command I'm going to run here is pwd to print our working directory. Okay, so we've already seen this before. The full path to our working directory is /opt/Drupal. The next command I'm going to run is ls to list the contents of our directory. So based on our previous Drupal installation with no data persistence, we would have been expecting a Drupal project in this directory. But our Docker Compose file has overridden that process. So now we're expecting this directory to be empty since this directory is the same as our Drupal-data directory, okay? So I'll run the ls command, and as expected, our working directory is empty. And if we navigate to our localhost on port 8082, I believe that's the port we allocated to this container. We'll see there's no Drupal software in this Drupal container. So this is not a problem. We do have Composer installed in this container. So all we have to do is run the Composer command again. So I'll go to Drupal.org and copy the Composer command. I actually have it already highlighted. I'll paste this on the terminal. And I'll add a period here to create our Drupal project right inside this directory. This will take a little while. Okay, so Composer has finished creating our Drupal project. If we type ls again, we'll see that indeed we now have our Drupal project back. If we also check our Drupal-data directory on our host computer, sure enough, we also have our Drupal project in there. From this point on, if we remove our Drupal container and start a new one, our Drupal website is intact. The new container will have the contents of our Drupal-data directory, okay? And since we have our Drupal project back, let's go back to our web browser to complete our Drupal website installation. For our database name, we used database2 as the name. It's the same for our database username and password. So we'll copy and paste. For the advanced options, our host is MariaDB2. So we'll copy and paste that in there. Everything else looks good. So we'll save and continue. Drupal is now being installed. Okay, so let's configure our website. For our website name, we'll call this Drupal 2 persistent site. Email address is drupal2@160bits.com. We'll use test2 for our username. And we'll copy and paste that for the password field. Everything else looks good. So we'll save and continue. Okay, Drupal is now installed and configured. Let's create a test article. We'll call this persistent article. This article will persist on our website. We'll save and publish. So we'll have both our Drupal websites created. Our Drupal 1 test site doesn't have data persistence, while our Drupal 2 persistent site has data persistence. Let's go ahead and remove these Docker containers. The objective here is to test our data persistence. For Drupal 1, I'll make sure I'm in my directory where my Docker Compose file is located, and I'll run Docker Compose down. This command will remove our Docker containers. And we can confirm this by typing Docker Compose PS. We'll do the same for our Drupal 2 project. We'll type Docker Compose PS again to confirm. Okay, these containers have now been removed. Let's go to our browser to confirm. You can see we don't have our Drupal websites anymore. Okay, so let's create new containers with the same Docker Compose setup. We'll start with Drupal 2. We'll make sure we'll have our Docker Compose file here. And we'll run Docker Compose up with the option D, so it runs in the background. Okay, so Docker has created new Drupal and MariaDB containers. We can see these containers by running Docker Compose PS. Now let's create new containers for our Drupal 1 project. Once we're in our project directory, we'll run Docker Compose up with the option D. Okay, so Docker has created new containers, and we can always see these by running Docker Compose PS. All right, let's navigate to our localhost to see these Drupal websites. We'll start with port 8081, which is our Drupal website with no data persistence. And as you can see, we lost our previous Drupal installation. Our previous Drupal website is gone. We'll have to set up a new Drupal website, okay? Now let's try port 8082, which is our Drupal website with data persistence. And as you can see, we have our Drupal website intact. We have a persistent article. And we could log back into our Drupal website. I believe we used test2 as our username and password. So I'll copy and paste that. Okay, now we're logged in. And we can navigate the site and everything looks the same. Here's our persistent article. You know why this is, right? When Docker read our Docker Compose file with our volume mappings, it mounted our Drupal-data and MariaDB-data directories on our Docker containers. And everything worked the same, as if the previous containers were not deleted in the first place. Okay, so we have one more Drupal installation to go, where we explore Drupal networking with Docker. Let's head back to our visual board to learn more about this Drupal installation. For this Drupal installation, we're going to demonstrate networking with Docker containers. We'll connect a new Drupal container to an existing network of containers so that we can use a MariaDB database within that network to install Drupal. We'll be using the network created automatically by Docker Compose in our previous installation as our existing network. Here's a summary of the steps we'll take to achieve this. First, we'll manually create a new database in the MariaDB container for our existing network. This will be the database for our new Drupal installation. Next, we'll create a new Drupal container using Docker Compose with Drupal as the only service defined. After that, we'll connect our new Drupal container to the existing network. This will enable Drupal to interact with the MariaDB container to access the newly created database. Finally, we'll install our new Drupal application using the newly created database. Back on the terminal, we could actually perform this Drupal installation in a couple ways. One way would be to create a Drupal container first, create the MariaDB database, then connect the Drupal container to the network containing the MariaDB database, then install our Drupal software. Or we could create the MariaDB database first, create a Drupal container, then connect our Drupal container to the Docker network where the MariaDB database is located. I'll go with the latter, so we'll create a database first, okay? So in order to connect to our MariaDB database, we're going to be using a tool called Adminer. Adminer is a tool that helps us to connect to our database using the web browser. With the Adminer software, we have a more visual way to connect and manage our database using a web browser. We can perform CRUD operations on our database using this tool. But before we move forward, I do want to make a correction to our previous Drupal setup, okay? We previously mapped port 8092 on our host computer to port 8092 on the Adminer container. So this mapping was wrong, okay? The correct mapping on the adminer container is port 8080. Adminer in the container by default is configured to listen for HTTP connections on port 8080. So please make sure to change your port mapping accordingly. You can still map whatever port that's available on your host computer, but you should map port 8080 on your adminer container, okay? Okay, I'll save this. Next, I'll start our existing Drupal setup, and then I'll go ahead and create a new MariaDB database. So I'll make sure I'm on my project directory. Then I'll run docker compose up with the option D, so it runs in the background. Now that the containers have been created, I'll go to the browser and connect to the MariaDB database. So I'll type localhost, and we're connecting to port 8092. Okay, so we are connected to our adminer container. Now let's enter our MariaDB database credentials. The system is MySQL, so that's correct. For the server name, adminer is able to communicate with MariaDB using the service name, which we named MariaDB2. For the username and password, we'll use our root username. We're not connecting to a specific database, so we'll leave that option empty. Okay, so we're connected to a MariaDB container, and we can see the previous database we created. So we'll create a new database here, and we'll call this database 3. To create our database user, we'll go to privileges, create a new user. We'll leave the server name as it is, which means any host. We'll call this user database 3 for convenience. And we'll copy and paste that in the password field as well. We'll grant all privileges on our database to this user. We'll save, and our new database has been created. Okay, so let's head back to our terminal and create a new Drupal project. So I'll make sure I'm in my root directory, and I'll create a new directory here. I'll call this Drupal 3, since this is our third Drupal installation. Since I'll be using Docker Compose, I'll also create a new Docker Compose file. Now that our Docker Compose file is created, let's add some information. I'll start with the version. Then the services. And the only service I have here is Drupal. I'll call this Drupal 3. The image is Drupal with the tag latest. For the ports, I'll map port 8083 on our host computer to port 80 on the Drupal container. Remember to always map port 80 to the Drupal container, okay? Because Apache inside the container is configured to listen for HTTP connections on port 80. Next is volumes. So for the volumes, I'm actually going to copy and paste the volume mapping from our previous Drupal installation because it's basically the same. And this also means I have to create a Drupal-data directory for this. Now we have our Drupal-data directory. Everything else looks good. So we'll save. So what I'm going to do next is start this Drupal service. I'll make sure I'm in my project directory here where I have my Docker Compose file. And I'll run Docker Compose up with the option D so it runs in the background. Okay, we'll have our Drupal process started. And we can confirm by running Docker Compose PS for processes. Okay, so we do have a Drupal service running, but I assume you already know that we don't have a Drupal project in a container because of our volume mapping. So the next thing we're going to do is connect to our Drupal container and run our composer command to create a Drupal project. Okay? So to connect to our Drupal container, the command is docker compose exec Drupal3 bash. Remember, Drupal3 is the service name for our Drupal container. Okay, now we're in the Drupal container. So first, I'll type pwd to print our working directory, just making sure we're in the right place before running the composer command. The next command I'll run is ls to make sure that indeed we don't have a Drupal project in this directory. And yes, we don't have a Drupal project. So I'll go to drupal.org and copy the composer command. And I'll paste it here on the terminal. And I'll add a period here to create a Drupal project in this directory. Okay, so this will take a little while, so we'll wait for that to finish. Okay, so Composer is done creating our Drupal project, and we can confirm by typing ls again. And now we can go to our local host on port 8083 to access our Drupal project. So we're ready to install Drupal, but we can't connect to the MariaDB database yet. I mean, we can try to, and let's actually try to do that, okay? So we used database tree for our database name. And it's the same for our database username and password. So we'll copy and paste that. And paste it here as well. So for the host, the MariaDB service name is MariaDB2. So we'll put that in there. And we'll save and continue. And as you can see, we can't connect to our MariaDB database yet. We're not on the same network with our database server. So let's head back to the terminal and fix this. I'm going to exit from the Drupal container. So our goal here is to connect our Drupal container to the network that includes our MariaDB database container. But first, we need to find the network. So I'll type docker network ls to list our existing networks. So there's a bridge network here that Docker Compose automatically created for our second Drupal setup. The name of that network is Drupal2 underscore default. When you use Docker Compose, it automatically creates a bridge network for all the services in the Docker Compose file. The name of that network is usually your project directory name underscore default. Okay? Now what we're going to do is inspect this network. And to do this, we'll run docker network inspect, and then I'll paste the network name. So when we inspect this network, we'll see all the containers connected to it. Here you can see the containers group, and below you'll see the containers in this network. Here's our MariaDB container. Also, we have our Drupal container here. And we also have our adminer container. All right, so we do want to connect our new Drupal container to this network, okay? So next, we'll get the name of our container because we need that to be able to connect to the network. So here in my Drupal project, I'm going to run docker compose ps. And here's my Drupal container. So right here is the name. So I'll copy that. Next, I'll connect my Drupal container to the Drupal2 underscore default network. And the command for that is docker network connect Drupal2 underscore default. And I'll paste my container name. So this will connect our Drupal container to the network, and that's basically all we have to do, okay? In order for our Drupal container to use the MariaDB database in that network. Okay, so it looks like that's done. So what we're gonna do is inspect the network again. So we'll type docker network inspect, and I'll paste the network name. Okay, so let's see what containers are in the network now. We'll look for the container section, and here's a MariaDB container. Here's our Drupal container. Here's our adminer container. And then we also have our new Drupal container, okay? So yes, our Drupal container is now on the same network with our MariaDB container. And we could actually just go back to our browser to continue our Drupal installation. I'll copy the username and paste it in the password field. And for our advanced options, the MariaDB service name is correct. Our Drupal container can now communicate with the MariaDB container using the service name since they're on the same network. Everything else looks good. So we'll save and continue. Okay, there you go. Our Drupal software is now being installed. Okay, so let's configure our website. I'll call this Drupal 3 test site. Email is drupal3@160bits.com. For the username, we'll use test3. And we'll copy and paste that in the password fields. Everything else looks good. So we'll save and continue. Okay, so our Drupal website is now installed and we can start building our website from this point on. And we still have our Drupal persistent site from our previous Drupal installation. And we can log into it as well. I believe we used test2 as our username and password. So I'll copy and paste that in here. And yes, we're able to log into our Drupal persistent site. We still have our persistent article and everything else looks good. All right, we've come to the end of our Drupal installation with Docker tutorial. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and if you did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and enable notifications for future videos. See you in the next video.